Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Ross Whitaker, and every fortnight or so, I want to dig deeply into the motivations of documentary filmmakers. How do they choose their subject material, and what approaches and strategies do they employ to fund, craft, and distribute their work? In this episode, I'm delighted to speak to Pete Middleton and James Spinney, the directors and producers of the Real Charlie Chaplin, a feature doc now available in cinemas in the UK and Ireland. Pete and James are the filmmakers behind the highly acclaimed film Notes on Blindness, and here they search for the real Charlie Chaplin in the story of a man who remained elusive to even those closest to him. Using a variety of techniques, the film tells the life story of Charlie Chaplin, his childhood poverty, his rise to unprecedented fame, his abusive relationships, his inspirational moments, and his stunning downfall. I loved it. Here's the trailer.
What was the first moment that you really knew you were famous?
I stalked New York. The headlines, he's here.
I knew Charlie when he was a little boy.
What was he like?
He's always funny. All the kids would die laughing at him.
Did you ever see them begging in the street?
Oh, yeah, it's terrible, the way these boys suffered.
That moment when you created the tramp outfit, what was your first reaction?
I felt so free. I could do any mad, crazy thing I like.
The public idolized Charlie.
It's all the adulation, not for me. It's for the little man.
He never felt anybody loved him. He never believed it.
He was always acting. He didn't want people to know the real Charlie. One's bound to be insecure with a childhood like his.
Most people who are tremendously successful at a young age, it usually destroys them. The internet only makes them.
Mr. Chaplin, are you a communist?
You have no patriotic feelings about this country or any other country. I have patriotism, and my patriotism rests with the whole world.
In the name of democracy, let us all unite!
He accomplished his life's dream, but I don't think he ever really got over his doubts.
He said to me, I used to be very famous. He needed an audience.
Everyone who gets too close to him, he'll end up suffocating. He couldn't help it.
Can I ask how old you were when you married him?
He was inaccessible in so many ways. I had grown up with the icon. But the man, I had no idea who the man was.
I'm delighted to be joined by Pete Middleton and James Spinney. To start off with, James, there have been many works about Charlie Chaplin. Could you give us a sense of the story and approach your film takes?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us, Ross. So our film is an attempt to look at the life and work of Charlie Chaplin and how those two things intersect, I suppose, because his life is so interwoven with his art. Chaplin used his tramp character to journey inwards and to journey backwards. He's constantly revisiting the traumas and humiliations of his childhood through his work. But more than that, I think we were interested in tracing how this extraordinary life story, which has been called one of the great rags to riches stories, which obviously then involves these great works of art, Chaplin's extraordinary body of work, how that also maps onto our idea of celebrity, I think, and how we communicate now, I suppose. You know, when Chaplin stepped on screen in 1914, films were just beginning to spread across the world, and within a couple of years, Chaplin was regularly being watched by hundreds of millions of people across the globe. Because the films were silent, they could be enjoyed by people of all backgrounds and all cultures. And Chaplin seemed to have this extraordinary ability to form this relationship from across the screen. You know, he looks out at us. He breaks the fourth wall constantly and is kind of checking in with us. He seems to sort of almost be kind of flirting with us, I think, at times when he looks out at us from the screen. And people all over the world kind of felt this connection, built up this connection, and begin to register this new thing that was being called the Chaplin craze or Charlie mania or Chaplinitis. And we kind of begin the film with this swirl of sort of imitators and impersonators and pirate films that are being made, because this type of celebrity was a completely new thing. You know, it's interesting to think that, you know, even a king, a queen, or an emperor, you know, before Chaplin wouldn't have had that type of relationship with a mass audience, because the ability to kind of transmit your personality, I suppose, through technology via screens was a totally new thing. So that really intrigued us. But more than that, I think this sense that the people all over the world had this relationship with him, but the people closest to him seemed to find Chaplin to be quite an elusive character. You know, his daughter Jane told us that she grew up with the icon, but she had no idea who the man was. So, you know, this is the film that spans Chaplin's entire life story. It's, you know, the 88 years that he was on planet Earth. It takes in, you know, what clips from his films. It's a huge swirl of kind of archive. But on top of that, we've also found recordings that haven't been heard before, including an interview with Chaplin from the 1960s, where he spoke to a Life magazine reporter for 3 days. Which is a very rare thing, because Chaplin didn't really like interviews, and he was quite reluctant to be put on tape. So this was a big find for us. We've also found an interview with his childhood friend Effie Wisdom, who spoke to the film historian Kevin Brownlow when she was age 91, and describes the kind of poverty that she witnessed Chaplin experiencing when he was just a boy. And then a third piece of archive, which is this extraordinary recording from the 1940s, where Chaplin's when Chaplin's under attack from the kind of American political and media establishment for his supposed communist sympathies, and that kind of forms the denouement for the film. And so we kind of wove those pieces of archive in with some new techniques, and yeah, we tried to make a sort of kaleidoscopic swirl that takes in this extraordinary life story.
So how did you guys come to be telling this story? I mean, I would have been very familiar with your work on Notes on Blindness and so on, and that was a film that touched a lot of people and definitely became part of, I suppose, the general conversation in documentary making. I still hear people referencing it all the time. How did you go from that film to making this film? Was it something that you sought out, or something that kind of came to you?
Yeah, I mean, so you're right, yeah, off the back of Notes on Blindness, which came out in 2016, we were then in contact with Passion Pictures, a producer called John Batzek, who we've been speaking to for a little while, and I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with some of the films that he's been involved in. Listen to Me, Marlon, Touching the Void, The Rescue this year. So John is certainly a presence on the British documentary scene, and we've been chatting with him, and he mentioned that he was in contact with a producer in the US, a guy called Ben Lindbergh, who had spent a number of years, I think the best part of a decade really, trying to convince the Chaplin estate that he should be the one to make a film about Charlie Chaplin, and to try and do a deal that wrapped up all of Chaplin's kind of all of his films, his full kind of creative and personal archive, and actually Ben had a personal connection with the Chaplin family. His mother went to ballet school with Geraldine Chaplin, Chaplin's eldest daughter. So there's a strong family connection there. And we got talking with Ben and with John, just trying to puzzle out what this approach would be. I mean, you know, it's Chaplin is such an enormous sort of cultural figure, and there's been so many great films made about Chaplin, so many hundreds of books in dozens of languages, and we were really sort of careful, I think, when we began the project to ensure that there was something new we could say, something new that we could bring to Chaplin's story, and some of the materials that James mentioned there were some of the things that we came across early on. We were in effect kind of given a list of things from the Chaplin estate, and actually right down the bottom of that list was this reference to the Richard Merriman interview, the 1966, a three-day interview, the best part of 20 hours worth of recording, and that was really the first thing we kind of zeroed in on. And I remember the first time we were listening to that. I mean, it's the extraordinary thing about it is, as James mentioned, Chaplin didn't like interviews. So Merriman had this technique whereby he would sort of set the audio recorder off in the car, And you'd hear the car radio playing and them doing their kind of testing of the equipment. And then you'd hear him getting out the car and the footsteps in the snow walking up to the house, which was this sort of palatial family home in Vevey in the foothills of the Alps by this stage. You hear him knocking on the door and you hear the voices of the family, and then their whole relationship being forged really as they kind of get to know one another. And at times Chaplin's not even aware that he's being recorded. After a couple of hours he'll turn to Merriman and say, why don't you start recording? And Merriman would say that he already was. And so it's an extraordinary sort of portal really into Chaplin's state of mind at that point in his life. And something about that really captivated us, I think. I mean, we knew then it wasn't just sort of a standard interview, which Chaplin had always kind of given, I suppose, in relation to his films, but they'd always been a little bit stilted. He didn't feel especially confident about it, and he was always very keen to control the narrative. And as we have a chance to listen to that and delve into some of the other materials, the project really kind of grew from there and took shape. And Chaplin is had such an extraordinary life, and there's so much material out there. Then it is you only need to sort of once you start pulling at these threads, something else is quickly revealed, and it became a bit of a rabbit hole for us, I suppose, for a few years.
Yeah, and I suppose if you think of Notes on Blindness, one of the extraordinary things about it is how you use that audio archive and then the lip syncing technique. Is finding that kind of material quite important to you guys and how you approach something to make sure that you're using, I suppose, the first-hand account and really putting that up there centrally and not making it about other people speaking about that person?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was very much something we were keen to pursue with this. I mean, having talked about Chaplin's interview in 1966, I mean, he's also very clear in that what the parameters are about it. So he's quick to kind of close Richard Merriman down whenever the conversation becomes uncomfortable for him. There's plenty that Chaplin should feel uncomfortable about in his history. His well documented relationship with women and the experience of Lita Gray, his second wife, that was when it came out in the 1920s, was this huge scandal at the time, and the biggest kind of divorce settlement in Hollywood history at the time, and Merriman edges towards that at times, and Chaplin's very kind of clear to close it down. And so we knew we needed to find something that could really balance, I suppose, provide a little bit of ballast to that sort of authored account, and that set us out looking for other materials. The recording with Chaplin's childhood friend was a huge one for us, but as well some of the unheard voices, I suppose, some of the people who had kind of first-hand experience of Chaplin and could speak with authenticity and authority, I suppose, to periods in his life. And we were helped enormously on the way. The BFI archives, the archives of Kevin Brownlow, were really opened up to us, and yeah, I mean, as filmmakers, it really is something we're very much drawn to, I suppose, is trying to find those underappreciated or lesser heard stories, and really, there's with Chaplin, there have been so many versions of the Chaplin story told over the years, and not least Chaplin's own kind of account that he actually published in his autobiography just a year before this interview we talk about, that we really wanted to find something that could kind of push against that, I suppose.
Speaking about then using those interviews and bringing them into a kind of dramatic scenario, which is the sort of reconstructions or dramatizations, the lip syncing of actual characters or actors playing these characters. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that? It's really kind of, I find it amazing actually. And also I think what it does from a filmmaking point of view is it brings you kind of out of the documentary form. It brings more variety to the film, particularly in the case of this one where you've got archive as well and you've got his films and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach those dramatic scenes and I suppose how you do them so well?
For us, it feels very much an extension of the process of kind of researching and looking into a life, I think Chaplin's life spans 88 years, and for some portions of his life, he's probably one of the most documented people on the planet from that period. You know, when he becomes famous because of this extraordinary fame that he experienced. But in his early years, there's very little material of him. There's only a handful of photographs of him as a child from that very impoverished background that he experienced. So it's an interesting process to kind of go through and start mapping all of these fragments that exist onto a kind of timeline and say, you know, where is the person in all this? How do we find? And at points, you have this tremendous richness of material. At other points, there's nothing. You know, at times it feels a bit like that scene near the end of Citizen Kane, where you've got all those kind of objects piled up and all that kind of. And I suppose in some ways, we've always seen it as kind of an imaginative art as well, you know, making a biography, because I think you've constantly got these tiny viewpoints and glimpses into a life, and then you're trying to kind of use what else you know to kind of to put yourself in that room or that place, and listening to recordings like Chaplin talking in the 1960s or Effie describing the childhood of the 1890s. We sort of felt transported into the room with them as they spoke, you know. In the case of that Life magazine recording, there were hundreds of photographs taken by the actor Roddy McDowall at the same time. So as we listened to the recording of Chaplin speaking, we were kind of looking at these contact sheets and at these portraits of Chaplin, and it was hard not to kind of feel like we were there. You could hear the crackle of the fire. And that's a room that we'd visited as well, because it's now the Chaplin Museum. And so I think the idea of dramatizing them was sort of a response to this, really, this kind of this process that we'd gone on in researching it, and an attempt to kind of bring that imaginative sphere into the film. Partly as well because we were conscious that, you know, we're making the film. Chaplin died in 1977, so we're making the film several decades after his death, and though we hear from Chaplin's children near the end of the film who we spoke to, you know, we constantly felt that we were sort of following in the footsteps of other biographers who'd been tracing his life, you know, listening to these recordings. And we actually begin the film with images of a seance. And at times it sort of feels like a kind of seance-like process, because, you know, we've got all these materials and we're trying to summon a personality through them, through piecing them together. And so the dramatizations felt like a kind of a way to sort of reflect that imaginative process, but also to provide kind of maybe present tenses in the film as well. You know, it's a huge swirl of archive and film clips, and it spans 8 decades. And so I think having these little pockets where we could be present and kind of stabilize felt like a useful thing rhythmically as well, in terms of finding that path through the material.
And it's, you know, it obviously requires production design. It requires working with a director of photography in a different way than say, you know, an interview process that you might have in another documentary. Is that something that takes a lot of time? What's the lead time on planning, you know, a scene involving these actors in a location that looks, you know, exceptionally like where they would have been? Do you deliver a script for the lip syncing, or do they listen? Just a little bit about how you actually do that, because to get there and for it to work so well, I presume there's tons of work in advance to make sure that it works on the day.
Yeah, I mean, it is a sort of a different set of mental faculties involved. I mean, we often sort of approach it, I think, as if a bit more like you might approach a sort of a narrative drama in a way. You know, as you say, there's the production design, there's working with the cast and the cinematographer, and you know, I think when we were filming out in Switzerland, so this is in the museum, and the room there, in its sort of state in the museum is as it was in the 1960s, and as much as possible they've tried to do it, but it's sort of to try and recreate that space, but it's also a museum, and that's not the same thing as a film set, you know. So it is quite a lot of work even just to overhaul that space for it, and of course, you know, as soon as you're sort of operating on that kind of scale, it does bring, a very different set of challenges to the kind of documentary faculties that might apply when we're looking through archives or when we're working with our editor and so forth. I think probably the most challenging aspect of it is that kind of work is the casting, really. It's an unusual technique. There's no doubt about that, and it's not something that all actors feel comfortable with, being sort of denied the voice, I suppose. We work with a fantastic casting director, Amy Hubbard, who also cast Notes on Blindness with us, and she also did Cleo Bernard's The Arbor. So she has a long, history of this particular niche, I suppose, of filmmaking, and she's got a really great sensibility and really great sense of performers who might respond to it. But the way that we work is that we sort of do a lot of that kind of research and as you say, sort of fashion the archive into what pretty much feels like a film script, I suppose, and then deliver that to the cast so that they can kind of listen to it, they can spend time with it, they can internalize it. And then, of course, on the day we don't record any sound on set. Instead, we have somebody who's kind of cueing the lines. Which does sound like a sort of strange configuration, but it is, surprising just how quickly the crew and everyone kind of gets into it. And I look back fondly on some of the experiences we had and filming this material for Chaplin. We'd been through that process with Notes on Blindness, and I think learned quite a lot from that, and learned sort of the potential pitfalls. But it is, it is a strange one, and not one that I think we'd undertake sort of lightly. I think for us, it needs to feel like it's justified, and it needs to feel like it's actually sort of serving the story. And as James spoke to there, that this idea of providing these little kind of worlds of presentness that we could sort of take the audience to, almost as a sort of a framework for different periods of Chaplin's life, meant that it felt like an appropriate technique to use.
So you don't record any sound when they're I presume they actually talk, though. Do they utter the words, or are they mouthing them?
Some do, some don't. Yeah, it's quite a idiosyncratic process. Yeah, I mean, one of the performers, who actually doesn't have very many lines in the film, he's an actor called Dickie Bowe, who plays Roddy McDowell, the photographer in Switzerland in 1966. This interview with Chaplin. He's done a lot of lip sync work before. He's got a lot of stage work, and has some fantastic and really inventive and really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with the art of lip syncing. And for him, I'm not even sure how many times he listens to the line. It just has a kind of an instinct, really. There is just something there that allows him just to kind of internalize it. And with him, we were never redoing a take because there were any trouble with the performance. It was always a technical thing on our side. Other people, it's a bit more work, or they're new to their technique, and it's something that kind of grows and develops throughout the production. And of course, not all of the different voices have the same challenges. Effie Wisdom, who's this childhood friend of Chaplin, who grew up with him on the streets of Lambeth in the 1890s, and speaks with such sort of vibrancy and radiance about their childhood, has a really strong and beautiful musical Cockney accent that isn't a voice that you hear very much these days. And we had a wonderful performer, Annie Rosenfeld, who hadn't done any lip syncing stuff before, and it's a very challenging voice to get into, but she did it with such skill, and we feel look very fondly upon those scenes with Effie, and are very grateful for everything that Annie gave to the production.
Yeah, she was absolutely amazing, wasn't she? I mean, so it almost feels impossible to just take one portion of his life, because everything that was happening was kind of so innovative for its time, and then ultimately where it ends up. It's, you think like how everything seems to be relatable to something else from his past, particularly from his childhood, and so in a way that there's nothing you can really leave out because it's all circular.
I think that's a very good way of looking at it. There is this real sense of causation that runs throughout Chaplin's life, I suppose. The way that the poverty of his childhood creates this sort of burning desire to achieve success, and of course that far surpasses even Chaplin's wildest expectations, I'm sure, and it becomes a sort of a crisis of personality, I suppose, in those early years as he tries to sort of balance that huge scale of celebrity that he manages to reach, and the insecurity that comes with that. And then, of course, Chaplin himself and his character, this great kind of artistic creation of the Tramp, is threatened by the oncoming of sound in the late 1920s, and the scandals that swirl around some of his relationships, not least Lisa Gray, his second wife, and because he's always sort of journeying inwards and always putting his kind of his himself into the and his experiences into his character, that then leads in the 1930s from grappling with the sort of crisis of capitalism in modern times and the Great Depression, and of course the rise of fascism and the great clash of ideologies is throughout the latter part of that decade, where he's in effect sort of forced to kind of put his Tramp character on the altar and in a sense sort of sacrifice him in the closing speech of that film, which in a way sort of unravels that sort of sense of this Tramp being a universal character that everyone could relate to. He's sort of forced to sort of nail his colours to the mast there. That in turn then leads to the sort of spiral of the 1940s as he gets caught up in McCarthyism and keeps making these sort of gestures, these political kind of posturing towards communism that will ultimately lead to his undoing. So there is a real kind of sort of thread there that runs through his life, this great kind of canvas of a life that spans, the entirety of the first half of the 20th century. And Chaplin went on to make films in 6 decades of the 20th century. It's an extraordinary sort of life and career. And so I think that certainly was something we were sort of wrestling with. I mean, strangely, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I think we'd always, from very early on, sort of set upon the idea of trying to take on the full scope of it, the challenge of trying to take on the full scope of Chaplin's life. And as you were talking there, Ross, I was just thinking that actually, in the spanning the duration of the production, there were several other Chaplin films that came out. There's a drama about the grave robbery, just focusing on individual events from Chaplin's extraordinary sort of life. There's a drama that came out about the grave robbery. There was a film about his time in the 30s, a documentary about his time in the 1930s that just focused on his experience in Bali. So there's more kind of pointillist approaches to Chaplin's life, but somehow we'd always sort of got it into our heads that we'd try and take on the entire thing. And that's certainly how things panned out.
I wonder then about narration. Was that something that kind of enabled you in a way? Because to be able to go through his entire life, and you had access to that archive, and it felt like you had the opportunity to, I suppose, to do something really thorough and the support there to do that and make something that felt like, this is the one documentary you need to watch about Charlie Chaplin. But I'm thinking, as I look at it now in retrospect, I think, well, God, narration must really help in that respect, because it does allow you to sometimes just go from, maybe cut out a step or get somewhere a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, I think as you say, it's that ability to kind of take very sharp turns from one place to another that we felt very liberated by as soon as we introduced the narration. And I think it also allowed us, funnily enough, to be a bit more playful. It allowed us to kind of to investigate things in a way that kind of, for us, followed the strange kind of wild goose chases that you end up going on when you're researching a project about Chaplin. One example would be this court case that took place in the 1920s where Chaplin sues an imitator called Charles Aplin, who was a Mexican actor who was sort of ripping him off. And so Chaplin sued Aplin, and then Aplin ended up turning the tables on Chaplin by saying that he wasn't imitating Chaplin, he was imitating Billy West, who was the famous Chaplin impersonator. And so this court case that begins as a kind of intellectual property dispute ends up kind of, in fact, backfiring and going into the whole origins of, well, did Chaplin invent the tramp costume? There's plenty of people who were contemporaries of his or elders of his when he was with Fred Karno, who said that they created a costume that involved those same elements. And I think being able to take a more idiosyncratic approach to kind of following those leads and going down these little rabbit holes was really liberating to us. And that actually happened a couple of years in, after we'd already been making the film along lines of just using archive or just using, or mainly being framed around these little dramatic pockets that we've talked about. And we were very lucky to be able to find a voice that we felt kind of matched that sort of that playful approach as well in the voice of Pearl Mackie, who's just wonderful and who we felt captured a kind of a Chaplin-esque spirit as well. She has that kind of that same sort of mischievous ability that Chaplin has to kind of feel like he's sort of slightly teasing, but also you'll follow him down that road. We felt at times like we wanted the narration to feel a bit like it's just someone sitting next to you in the auditorium, kind of watching the film with you almost, and kind of piping in when you need them. And Pearl's also, she grew up in South London, not far from where Chaplin did. So that was another connection for us. And we feel really lucky to have worked with her. She was great.
Yeah, it's great. And it almost, I suppose, feels a little bit more theatrical in a way, a type of narrator than a typical documentary narrator, which is very fitting for the story that you're telling, and it works really well. And yeah, I thought that was great. I mean, as we talk about all these things, we keep mentioning the edit, and as you said, the film took 3.5 years to make. Were you in and out of the edit, or were you doing some editing yourselves? And I know in a funny way, I know it sounds odd, but I loved the way it took 3.5 years. But then when you got to the end of it, it was really, really worth it, because it's an exceptional film. But sometimes we can feel like, I've been working on this film for so long now, that can be seen as a negative thing. But ultimately, if it gets you to where you need to get to, then it's well worth it. How was that process, I suppose, and particularly in relation to the edit? Was that something you would do a little bit of it, stand back from it, look at it, and then be able to kind of reconsider where you were going, or how did that work?
I mean, I guess it had different kind of phases, I suppose. We talked a bit earlier about the sort of production process involved in kind of mounting the dramatic restaging of these audio materials with lip syncing and the actors, and that's there's a sort of a gear shift when you move into that sort of side of things that sort of consumes all of your energies. In our case, in this, probably for the best part of sort of 5-6 months. And during that stage, we're not doing much in the way of kind of editing work. Before that, of course, we've done a lot of the research where we're experimenting with the potential of the materials, trying to find as many different kind of audio sources or archival sources that we feel could either be adapted for the sort of dramatic restaging, or we think would have could exist in their own right, working as, I suppose you might call, sort of conventional archive sources. Unpacking Chaplin's films, we had we worked with a friend of ours who spent I can say how long, actually, over a period of a couple of years, just had this project whereby he'd sort of dismantled every Chaplin film and broke it down into this sort of constituent elements. Every kick, every kind of hat tip, every flick of a cigarette butt. He sort of broke down all of Chaplin's shorts, all of his features, and we were able to kind of I suppose taxonomize them in that sense. And And so that was one element of it. Our main editor, Jules Quantrill, who we worked with on our previous film, Notes on Blindness, sort of came in and out and did an intensive period after we'd filmed a lot of the drama material. And then, of course, the pandemic, put a bit of a spanner in the works. I think we were sort of supposed to lock picture in April 2020. And as things began unraveling around the pandemic, that very much kind of set us back. And we were supposed to be playing at film festivals that autumn in 2020, all of which sort of got cancelled. So yeah, it was a stretched process, but yeah, it was one that I think gave us time to take step back and appraise things and allow it to sort of incubate. And I think we've always found in our work, time is and I'm sure many filmmakers out there will agree that you've had on your show. Time is a really kind of integral factor for when you're trying to approach a subject such as this in a thorough fashion.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's not just the films; it's also the outtakes, or the takes that didn't find themselves into the film. As you see how Chaplin grapples with directing somebody, or grapples with trying to get a scene to work, and ultimately, actually, I don't want to give anything away. In one scene he figures it out, but you see him struggling with it within. I mean, I don't know what the question is actually, but it's extraordinary level of detail that you must have gone into in the material. I mean, or was that, did that come from somewhere else? Was that through reading a biography and realizing this happened? Or
so I should absolutely have said that, we're also sort of standing on the shoulders of some fantastic Chaplin scholarship that has gone over the years, and that's part of the early process for us, is to try and seek as much of that out as possible. And we've mentioned a few times Kevin Brownlow, the film historian, and he did some fantastic work specifically relating to Chaplin, and of course great legacy and contribution to silent cinema more broadly, but specifically in Chaplin, he had a research project that he undertook in the late 1970s that carried on through the 1980s, and culminated in the release of a 3-part series, The Unknown Chaplin, which which very much goes into Chaplin's kind of work as a director, his kind of creative approach, and unearthed all of those outtakes that you mentioned there. Did an extraordinary job of managing to persuade a film collector to sort of part with them, and they now all reside in the BFI, and many researchers and film and Chaplin enthusiasts and film historians have had the opportunity to kind of analyze that stuff, and we were very fortunate to be tapping into a lot of that research, and there were many historians and Chaplin enthusiasts who were incredibly generous with their time and energies and resources in letting us into this world.
One of the things I loved about the film was that you could think going into it as a viewer that you are going to be watching a film about someone that's long dead, about events that happened a long time ago. But for me, it felt just really contemporary in so many ways. One, in terms of your brilliant filmmaking, but also in terms of I suppose the connections to stories of celebrity now, somebody being cancelled, how he approaches relationships. There's so many things in it that just felt resonant. Is that something that attracted you to the project maybe, or is that something that sort of you brought to it or started to discover as you made it?
Absolutely. I mean, it was very early on when we began to kind of immerse ourselves in Chaplin's films and understand more about him. And the thing that struck us most particularly was that connection that he forged. And this is what audiences would have experienced when they first stepped into the cinema in the mid-19-teens, that way that he's sort of looking out at you from that screen, that connection that he forges. And in a way, Chaplin is a very modern character, that tramp character, the way that he was able to sort of journey inwards to put so much of himself into his films, not only his childhood, but his experiences, and always responding to that moment in the day. That feels like something that's very, very modern, even from today's perspective. And of course, you mentioned the sort of the more overt sort of threads there, the resonances that connect with the present day. I mean, when we were making the film, there was we began in sort of 2017. So of course, politically speaking, globally there was a rise in strongman politics and politicians who seek to sort of divide and look towards more divisive kind of political ideologies. And Chaplin is most famous for the stand that he took against fascism, and that speech at the end of the Great Dictator, where he's challenging sort of greed and division and strongman politics. And of course, we've talked a little bit about Chaplin's relationship with women, and what particularly struck us in that is just the way that society responded at the time. So in the mid 1920s, when Chaplin was involved in what at the time was the most expensive divorce settlement in Hollywood's history, there was a real sense of the establishment, both the media establishment and the political establishment and the intellectual establishment, standing behind Chaplin, and rounding on Lita Gray, who was just a teenager at the time. You know, the headlines that accompany those court proceedings are really quite uncomfortable, even from this day. You know, she was widely sort of dismissed as a gold digger and a little whore, and really spoken in quite nasty language. That is something that the sort of struggle for particularly female voices to have their stories heard is something that, of course, you know, the institutions, the entertainment industry has been grappling with in the last few years. With Me Too and the Time's Up movement. So that was all very much sort of percolating, I suppose, as we were making the film. And on that, we were particularly interested in the way that in the 1920s, as I say, there was Chaplin's celebrity afforded him something of a kind of some protection, I suppose. In the 1940s, when a similar pattern of behaviour occurred with Joan Barry, another young actress who had come to Hollywood sort of seeking a break in the movies and had fallen into the company of Chaplin, and again had very disturbing stories about how that relationship unfolded. At this point in Chaplin's career, when he no longer had the tramp character to sort of shield him, and his then the affection of the public had begun to fall away. The political establishment were able to turn that against him, and J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in cahoots with Hedda Hopper and some of the nastier elements of the right-wing media were able to turn that against him. And for us, it was very interesting if you look at the parallels between those cases and what that says about the institution of celebrity. So yeah, there was a lot in there that we felt was a lot of resonances in there that we felt would connect with modern audiences.
Thanks again to Peter Middleton and James Spinney for taking part in the interview. The Real Charlie Chaplin is available in cinemas and on demand across the UK and Ireland from February 18th, 2022. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.